Okay, we are recording. We are recording.
What about before? We were talking about it, but now we're talking about Kiddush.
Anybody care that we are recording?
Okay, we are recording. We are live. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Shabbat Tov. Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Adar Bet. Mishnechnas Adam Abin B'Simcha. So a month ago we spoke about should we have Simcha in Adar Aleph or not. And I bet everybody agrees this is a time when Abin B'Simcha B'Bat Hashem. Should be a month with lots of good news. So we are continuing Hilchot Kiddush. And we have quite a lot to talk about, so it'll take us a few weeks. We are in volume 17, Tzurba Marabanan. We are, if I'm not mistaken, in the first year in this volume, which is actually our second year on Kiddush. Last week we spoke about, been discussing now for a couple of weeks. One of the things we spoke about, what happens if you don't have wine? Could a person make Kiddush with bread? We spoke about the minhag that some have over here on Shabbat, right? The Yekish minhag to go and to wash first, and then make Kiddush, and then have the bread. Right? We saw the discussion in the Gemara as to whether you could make, if you prefer bread, could you make Kiddush over bread rather than over wine? Nonetheless, nowadays, minhag ha'olam is that we make Kiddush over wine, right? Unless there are extenuating circumstances. We spoke about the difference between Kiddush at night and Kiddush during the day, in terms of if one doesn't have wine, what would one use, bread or otherwise. Let's pick up on page 33 in the book. You'll see the heading which says using other drinks for Kiddush. This is a question which came up last week as well, and let's discuss. So here, the Gemara has a story. By the way, just before that, it was Chodesh Adar coming up to Purim, so there's a pasuk in the Megillah, it's very interesting. We know, Chazal tell us that wherever the Megillah says Hamelech HaChashverosh, referring to Hamelech HaChashverosh, but where it just says Hamelech Stam, it says the king. So of course it's talking about Hachashverosh, but there's a hint that it's referring to Melech Malchem Lachim, Tzakadosh Baruch. So there are some psukim that's much easier to understand how the word Hamelech relates to Hashem, and there are some psukim where it's much more difficult. For example, in the first perek, so there's a mishteh of 180 days, and after it there's another 7 days, and it says B'yom hashvi'i ketov lev hamelech beyayin. On the 7th day, when the king was drunk, and the whole story with Vashti takes place. How can that passage possibly? What is the hint? What is the allusion talking to? So I believe that it's the Arizal who says B'yom hashvi'i is a hint here, refers to Shabbat. B'yom hashvi'i ketov lev hamelech beyayin. That on the 7th day, the Melech, the king, is pleased with our yain, with our wine, which is referring to Kiddush, so we make on Shabbat. So that is a nice hint from Megillat Esther. It's not Purim Torah, it's actually said by the Arizal. Okay, but we're now on page 33. Says what if we don't have that yain, right? So can we still have Tov Lev HaMelech without yain? So here says the Gemara, source number 26. The Gemara Pesachim tells us the following story. Amrile Maryanuka Markashisha Braid Rav Chisda. Okay, if these were their actual names or not, I'm not sure, but the sons of Rav Chisda were called Maryanuka and Markashisha, which literally means the younger one and the older one. Okay, maybe it was nicknamed. That's how they're referred to. In any event, so they said the following to Rav Ashi. It happened once that Ameima came to our location, and it was over Shabbat. We did not have wine. Now here the Gemara is talking about Havdalah. It's not talking about Kiddush, it's talking about Havdalah. But they didn't have wine for Havdalah. So Eitina le Shefa, so they brought him beer. Beer, by the way, is usually in the Gemara when it talks about Shechar, it's usually talking about date beer. That was the most common beer they had in those days. But so they brought him that to make Havdalah. He didn't make Havdalah over a course. And he fasted the entire night. He wouldn't eat anything. The halacha is you're allowed at the end of Shabbat. Later on, we'll get to Shirim Motzei Shabbat and Havdalah. At the end of Shabbat, once you've said Havdalah, or you've said Baruch HaMavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol, you can then do Melacha, but you can't eat a meal, you can't eat or drink, aside from water, until you've made Havdalah over a course. So he did not make Havdalah and he did not eat. We saw that he was going through, he was fasting, it was causing him a difficult situation. So in the morning we went and we managed to procure some wine, and he made Havdalah. The time and then he ate. Leshana tu ikalafre. And a year later, he came back. He was visiting again. Lo hanan chama. And again, we didn't have wine. So what happened? So Aitina Shechla, we brought him beer. So then he said, Amal Yachi Chema Medinahu. He said, okay, now I understand. If it's happened again, right, this clearly you don't have wine in your place, you substitute wine with beer, and therefore that is considered Chema Medina. That is considered literally the wine of the province. And this is a concept that we have, and we'll have to talk, and we'll talk later on, how precisely we define this Chema Medina. There are poskim who hold that nowadays there is no other drink which actually qualifies as Chema Medina, but nonetheless there's another significant drink if wine is not readily available, and this is what they use instead. So what seems to be the conclusion of this Gemara is that Chema Medina can be used for Havdalah. What is Chema Medina? Generally speaking, we would say assume beer or another type of alcoholic beverage. That would be the preference. You'll see over the page on number 34, without getting into all of it, there are a number of different opinions here. But the question that is raised is whether this applies both to Havdalah and to Kiddush. You see, according to most opinions, that we're much more flexible when it comes to Havdalah. To say Kiddush over Chema Medina is going to be a lot more problematic. That is the distinction which arises from the Gemara. In a moment, we'll see why that is. Source number 28, well, later on as well, it says Tanura Banan, Ein Makachin ala Shecha, says one should not make Kiddush over beer, over Chema Medina, Mishum Mabir Azabo Bishim Rameh Mekachin. So we see here that there is a machloket. It might be what's behind the machloket is as to whether if we say that we can make Kiddush or Havdalah with Chema Medina, does that mean in a place where you have wine available, or only in a place where you don't have wine available? Okay, we'll get into it in the Rishonim in just a moment. 9 days of Havdalah, so that's a separate question. Generally, I think the reason why you would not use wine is because during the 9 days you have not to drink wine. So for Kiddush, there's obviously no problem because that's on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're allowed to. Havdalah is by definition the end of Shabbat. So there are those who still use wine. There are those who prefer to use wine or grape juice. There are those who prefer to use Chema Medina. Again, it relates to this topic. As in, if we say that it's halachically acceptable to use it, if we say it's halachically problematic in a place where you have wine, so then that would trump it. But that is a separate question, which is related, but we'll get to it closer to. Hopefully, it won't be relevant this year, but if it is, we'll discuss it later on. In any event, so the Ritzkei, source number 29, he explains why do we make a distinction between Kiddush and Havdalah. Again, we haven't gone into all of the details yet, but what emerges clearly from the Gemara is that Chema Medina, there is much more room regarding Havdalah than it is regarding Kiddush. So says the Ritzkei, one of the Rishonim, he says, he says, even if you say that beer is considered Chema Medina, we would not make Kiddush on it at all. This is one opinion. Why? As we discussed last week at length, there is a halachic concept of making Kiddush over bread. Again, our minhag nowadays is that if we have wine, we won't make Kiddush over bread. But we saw, according to some of the Rishonim, you could do that. And certainly if you don't have wine on Friday night, for sure, then you would make Kiddush over the bread. So since you have bread, if bread comes in the hierarchy before Chema Medina. So if you have an alternative for wine, you use the bread. However, when it comes to Havdalah, there's no bread at Havdalah, it's only the wine. There's no option to substitute it for bread. Therefore, that says the Ritzkei. That is how I hold. Rambam says similarly in source number 30, Medina. Again, so if you're in a place where the majority accepted drink is beer as opposed to wine, it's Chema Medina. So clearly says the Rambam, you cannot make Kiddush on Chema Medina, only on wine. Again, this is without getting into the discussion later. What is Chema Medina? It's not so clear nowadays exactly what beverage would qualify. But if it is, it's probably, as I said, probably an alcoholic drink. Now, the Rosh, in source number 31, has a bit of a compromise position. He says, שמקדשין על השחר, היכא דבי חמי המדינה, וכן כתב רבינו אבן, דמקדשין על השחר, אימו חמי המדינה. So that's a view which we've just seen, that one could substitute wine for another beverage. And it says the Rosh in the second paragraph at the bottom of page 35. Yireli, אף על פי שיכול לקדש על השחר אימו חמי המדינה, says so you could use it, טוב הוא יותר לקדש על הפת, כיוון שהסעודה באה לכבוד שבת. It's better to, if you don't have wine, make Kiddush over bread. This is on Friday night. אבל בבוקר, שיברך על השחר קודם ברכת המוציא. But if it's in the morning, then it would be preferable to use beer or whatever else, if you don't have wine, rather than bread. אם לא כן, בטלה קידוש של היום. רבי נעים נקרא כמו קידוש הלילה, ולמה נבטלנו? כיוון שאפשר לקיימו על השחר. Says the Rosh, in the morning, at night, right, we discussed this last week. At night, if we don't have wine, so we say Kiddush over bread. What is Kiddush? You have a special bracha, B'chad Hashem, B'chad Shabbat, etc. In the morning, what is Kiddush? Kiddush is Borei Pre'agapim. That's it. All the psukim that we say before, we mentioned different minhagim, some say more, some say less. That's all extra. That is not an essential component of the Kiddush. And therefore, if you don't have wine, and you're just saying the bracha of Hamotzi Lechem and Haaretz, you're just having pat, you're going to have pat in the morning anyway. You're going to have your bread. You're just eating your meal. So if you don't have wine, then there is nothing recognizable that you're making Kiddush. Therefore, says the Rosh, in the morning, if you don't have wine, you need to have another beverage, to have that before your bread, and that will be your Kiddush. That will be recognizable. And that is the Shulchan Aruch, source number 32. He says, B'makom she'ein yain matzoi. Again, all of this is in a place where we don't have wine. Yesh omrim shemakachin ala shecha u'shal mashkin. There are those who say you should say a Kiddush over a different beverage, Chema Medina. Chutz min hamayim, it can never be water. V'yesh omrim she'ein makachin. Those who say no, you can't. Ula Rosh, and the opinion of the Rosh, which we've just seen, Balayla lo yekadesh ala shecha ala pat. At night, you don't have wine, make Kiddush on the bread. Ubaboker, and in the morning, yoter tov lekadesh ala shecha. Then you make Kiddush over beer or something else. Shevarech alav sha'akol. Obviously, you would say sha'akol, not break agafen. That's the bracha for the beverage. Kodem hamotzi. She'im yavarech alav pat tefila, ein kan shum shinoi. If you say the bracha of hamotzi first, you've done nothing different. There is no Kiddush. The divrei ta'am hen. So Chanan gives a score here to the Rosh. He says this is a well-reasoned svara, and it makes sense. Says the Ramah as well. Ken aminag pashut k'divrei harosh. That is the minhag. Now you'll see Mishnah Berurah at the bottom of the page. It says at the bottom, Siman Sifiran Kapte Tov LeKadesh. Zaynu debazeu yoter tov me'alapat k'mo shevoi shatam. Aval yayin b'makom shu matzui v'day yevarech alav afilu bayom. If you're in a place where wine is readily available, that is what you should use for Kiddush. Okay, now last week he was asked, there are those, historically there have been, we find this in the Sfarim, it's not made up, but there have been those who in the morning use scotch or whatever else it is to make schnapps for a Kiddush rather than wine. So it says here the Mishnah Berurah, he says, Mikom makom, b'mdinateinu shayayin beyoker, v'rov shtiyat ha'medina hu mishal mashkin. Says in our days, it's over 100 years ago, things have changed since then. But says the Mishnah Berurah, wine is very expensive. The majority of people drink other things. Lo nagu afilu hagdolim la'ader achal yayin b'yom. He says we find even gdolim, even great people, have not taken on the chumrah to have wine necessarily in the daytime for the daytime kiddush. Shakiddush shelo hu rak midrabanan lekol ha'am, as we discussed last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that the daytime Kiddush is certainly drabanan according to everybody, so therefore there's more room for leniency there. Okay, so he does conclude that it is still ideal to use wine even in the morning. But says the Mishnah Berurah, says where wine is readily available, it's what you should use. But there is a custom, there has been a custom to use other beverages in the daytime, and that is acceptable. In the next source, again, in a different, it's actually in the free.
Then he creates a circumstance, but I guess it's the rule, right? But because of this reason. Well, if that doesn't
right.
More sense.
Right. So the truth is, so I'll get to it in a moment because there's actually another issue that's raised, which is not brought here, but we need to mention. Over here he says, here, ala shecha, The im chaviv lo yain so. Okay, here the situation is not that wine is not available, but what if one prefers, right? One prefers whiskey. Can you imagine that? Somebody prefers whiskey to wine. Yachol lekadesh alav bayom lekatchila b'mdinatenu shehu chema medina. So he says, in our place where this is considered chema medina, you could use that even lekatchila during the day. So again, does this apply nowadays? So number one, we have the fact that wine is readily available, so that knocks that one out. Number two, the question is whether we actually consider it Chema Medina or not. Again, I know I've mentioned it 3 times about explaining why or why not, but I'm going to save that for a different show when we discuss Havdalah. We'll go into the intricacies of Chema Medina. Make sure you'll keep coming back. So that is a second consideration. But there is a third consideration here, which is the following. We haven't gone to it yet. We'll get to it a bit later. How much does one have to drink, or how much has to be in the cup when one has Kiddush? So we generally talk about a Ravi, so it's a substantial amount that one has to drink. Many people, if they make Kiddush over whiskey, certainly, they're not going to gulp. There may be some individuals who can do this, but most are not going to gulp a full cup. You have a little, or maybe even a shot glass, you have a little bit. How is that allowed? How is that okay? You don't have the minimum amount of measurement in order to make Kiddush. So we have a Taz. Very interesting Taz. Maybe to introduce us, let me share with you a story. The story that I have from our scholar is that once somebody was sitting in a shir bar of Neuvet. Rav Neuvet was the author of the Shema Shabbat Hilchot. And at the beginning of the shir, Rav Neuvet had a cup of tea or coffee, whatever it was, and he said a shakol, and he took a sip. And throughout the shir, he was sipping from the drink. And at the end, he made a borei nefashot. And so one of the Talmidim went up to him and said, "For a Rav, Torah evil and modern itzareh." Right? I need to understand. The halacha is that when it comes to bracha achrona, bracha rishona, bracha before a food you drink, you say no matter how little you consume. But there is a minimum amount, kazait or revid, right, which has to be eaten in order to make a bracha achrona, and it has to be consumed within a set amount of time. So generally speaking, we say that when one has a hot drink, you're sipping it bit by bit. You don't actually drink a bit in the requisite amount of time in order to be chayav in a bracha achrona. That is why some poskim say that if one's having a hot drink, you should leave a little bit at the end, wait for it to cool down, and then drink it in that much, and you can say a bracha achrona without any suffering. But generally speaking, we say that if you drink just a little bit, you just drink normal, you don't say bracha achrona over a hot drink, coffee, a chocolate, whatever it may be. So, but Rav Neuvet said the bracha. So the Talmud went up to him and he said, "Why? What's that based on?" So Rav Neuvet said to him, I used to think the same thing as you, but I was learning by my Rebbe, and he did the same thing. I was sitting and I saw he had the drink and he made the bracha achrona. So I went up and I asked him. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said to me, "I used to say the same thing as you, but Rav Zalman melted it." So that's a wonderful story that teaches us about how you cannot only learn from Svarim. We have a Masorah that we have to understand halakha as well. But what's the Svara behind it? Svara might be based on the Taz. That there's a Taz that says when it comes to a bracha achrona, yes, it's true that we have a certain amount, but different foods are consumed in different ways. And if you eat or drink a food in the ordinary way, of drinking that food, drinking that drink or eating that food is that one takes small sips or small bite at a time, then one would still be chayav to say a bracha achrona. That is what the Taz, that's what he says. Now, just before the story notwithstanding, we generally do not paskin it. Because we say, if that's the case, many of the other achronim argue with the Taz, because then it's really, Natat the Rechal Ashirin, you're going to say it's a different amount for each food, a different amount for each drink. It seems strange, but the pashut in Chazal and in Rishonim and in Poskim is that there is an objective measure. It's the same for every food. But nonetheless, the Taz says that. If we accept the Taz regarding a bracha achrona, we could then extrapolate from the Taz and say regarding Kiddush, that in the same way that the ordinary way of consuming this alcoholic beverage is, you have a small amount, that's normal consumption, that's enough for the shir for bracha achrona. That could also be the shir of a bracha for Kiddush. Again, that is said as more as a limud zchut than anything else in terms of this. The Mishnah Berurah is not so happy with it either. But first of all, we don't paskin that way that does in bracha achrona. And then we'd have to say that the Taz that we don't paskin Akin Bracha Achana has to apply to Kiddush, which he didn't talk about either. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but it exists as a limud zchut. But lekatchila, even if one is going to, if one has this practice, then one should really have a larger amount, at least have a larger amount in the cup. And again, the conclusion is at the end of the day, we don't have it here, but I think in the full course, the full discussion in the Mishnah Berurah, it says those who have that's their established minhag are allowed to continue with it. But if that is not your established minhag, the established minhag in most places nowadays is that you make kiddush over wine. That is what should be done. Certainly lekatchila. So you see as well, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was not happy about this. Source number 35. He says, "Inedat Maoran b'Beit Yosef B'Orchaim b'Shem Agod Maimoniot b'Shem Aviyah she'im yeshayin b'To Agmonia ela shu b'Yoker ein mekachinah." He just quoted what we said, that if wine is not available, you use a different beverage. V'lachen lo yafe osim kama nashim anagim lekedesh kiddush rabba al abiyah or sheicha afal pi sheish lo yain. So he says, right, it's worse than saying that it's asur. He says lo yafe. It's not appropriate. It's not nice. That which people do, where they make kiddush in a day. Last week we discussed why it's called kiddush rabba, right? Over beer or another alcoholic beverage when wine is available. Or they'll say wine's expensive, or they prefer it. He says no, that is not correct. He says it's true that the Bach, who's one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Torah, really, he took it upon himself to resolve this practice. We find this now up to times in Halacha. There's a practice that is established, and the poskim will write and explain to justify the minhag. But that doesn't mean that one should establish it if that is not the correct minhag. Certainly, since we follow the words of Maran of Beit Yosef, and therefore, okay, that's something that if there is no wine, something you could use it. We'll get to grape juice. We'll get to grape juice in a few moments. Yeah. Now, what happens if a person doesn't have wine and they don't have bread and they don't have any other alcoholic beverage? The person is in Azah or whatever it is, like Hayal, and they don't have. How do they make Kiddush? So says the Shemrat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 36. He says, "Ein lo yain, shekasher lo lishtot yain, lo yikrish hashem mashkeh acher, kidei le'el." Right, this is referring to the nighttime Kiddush. A person doesn't have wine or any other beverage they can use. What if they don't have bread either? He says then the next thing down in the pecking order is pata babakisni, which is essentially mezonot foods, which if you eat a large amount of them become a motzi. It should say baked goods from the 5 types of grain. You don't have that. Okay, so on whatever beverage that you have in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush. The next section talks about diluted wine. In the days of the Gemara, the wine is very, very strong, and there was a practice to dilute the wine. Nowadays we don't really do this. The Gemara has a whole discussion as to exactly what are the proportions and how much can you dilute, how much water can you add, that it's still considered wine. But I'm going to skip that for now because that's not. It's not so practical. You'll see page 42. The Pri Megadim, who already he says, nowadays our wines are not so strong. We don't really dilute them. If the majority is water, it will be charcoal. Okay, somebody else about grape juice. What about grape juice? This is a very interesting historical discussion as well. The truth is, when did the poskim start to ask the question? It was already in the 1920s, 1930s, in the era of prohibition in America, and there was a lot of controversy about this. There was an exception that was made for alcohol to be used for sacramental purposes, and then started with the conservative movement. Ginsburg went and told the government. They said, "Don't worry, we don't need wine because we can use grape juice." So the whole controversy that came out from there, and that is when the poskim really started to discuss this issue. So source number 44. Now, seemingly, the Gemara seemingly says explicitly that you could use grape juice, right? The Gemara Bava Batra says, "Damarava sochet adam mishkol shel anavim v'omer alav kiddush hayom." Person has a cluster of grapes and they squeeze it to get the juice out, the wine out, the grape juice, and with that they could use to make kiddush. So seemingly that is what we are dealing with when it comes to grape juice. However, not so simple. First of all, you'll see here underneath source number 44, it says, Shmuel Bosner quotes from Meiri, who explains, based on the continuation of the Gemara, that although lekatchila only fermented wine may be used on the altar, this requirement does not apply to Kiddush. When we talk about wine, or what is considered wine, it's the Gemara's whole discussion. We have wine in the context of Kiddush and Shabbat. We also have wine in the context of the Mizbeach, which is poured on with the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash. And certain types of wine are pasul, and certain types of wine are not valid. And there's a whole discussion over there. Are the types of wine could there be a type of wine that is invalid for the Mizbeach, or at least invalid lekatchila, but is still permissible for Kiddush? Seemingly, that is how the Meiri understands. Now, Rav Bosman understands, you see over here, source number 45, the Shevet HaLevi. He says, it's interesting, by the way, the Meiri was a Rishon, but the manuscripts were lost for many, many years and only discovered much later. So a lot of the Beit Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, when he brings different opinions of the Rishonim, the Meiri is not brought because they did not have access to it. So how do we relate to, that's another fascinating discussion, how do we relate to manuscripts, relate to Rishonim that were not accessible? Can we say, had the Shulchan Aruch seen the Meiri, he would have said differently. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. But says the Shevet HaLevi, most did not see the Meiri. But what does he say? המתוק מאליו בלא שום סיבה עד שאינו משקר פסול לגבי מזבח ומקדשין עליו עד כאן. Because again, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with this juice which was squeezed from the grape, but it has not fermented, so it has not become alcoholic. So he says that would be disqualified for use on the Mizbeach, but it would not be disqualified for Kiddush. That the Meiri says explicitly. So he says, Hinei lamadnu davar chadash, says Rav Osner, now in bold. The eino meshaker, eino pasul Kiddush, im belav achi torat yain pragafen alav. Obviously, it still has to be considered grape pragafen, if you add water and whatever, and loses that status, they're not. But he says that even though it is not alcoholic, that does not matter. That is okay, and that can still be used for Kiddush. Now, it's brought down there, Rabbi Elyashiv. That's learned in the Gemara. That's learned in the Gemara, so together. I just have to say, it's quite exciting, it's quite expensive. We're going through and reading all these Achronim after the Shabbat that we've just had. Rabbi Professor Steinberg stood here on Friday night and stood here on Shabbat morning saying, I asked this question of Rav Osner, and I asked this of Rabbi Elyashiv, and this is the Tzitziris, and here we are, Rav Osner, and Rabbi Elyashiv. It really comes alive. So says source number 46, this is Rav Yitzchak Derzi, who writes a Shut Shvut Yitzchak, and he quotes what he heard from Rabbi Elyashiv, who says, Kol she'en ra'oi liot ata yain, ein nafka mina bazeh שבשעה שנסחט היה ראוי להיות יין. Rabbi Elyashiv was machmir on this for the following reason. He says, the fact that it's not alcoholic is not a psul, does not make it invalid, so long as it could still become alcoholic. It has the potential. Now, when it comes to grape juice, which has you put chemicals in and preservative in such a way that you have stopped that process from taking place, now it doesn't matter that at the time that you squeezed it, it could have become. Now it cannot become. It does not have the potential to become alcoholic, and therefore that would be pasul. We have to mention as well, again, that's the opinion of Rabbi Elyashiv. Most of the other contemporary poskim, and just about everybody else says that no, it's still kasher. You can use it for
We'll use grape juice for.
I know Rav Shechter is machmir on this, but most are makel. There are two different types of grape juice, however. There is what's called mishumar, which is where preservatives have been added with chemicals, and then there's mifustar, where it's pasteurized. If it's pasteurized, it does still have the innate potential to come in to become alcoholic. So there, Bavelashit might allow it as well. But as we said, most of the poskim are lenient on this. This should not be confused, by the way, with the discussion regarding Leila Seder. So on Leila Seder, to drink wine for the 4 cups, there, I think it's Moshe Feinstein who's machmir as well. He wants to say that there it has to be yain mishaket. But even by Leila Seder, the truth is that most poskim are lenient as well. When I was in the army, not combat situation, but when I was in the army, I remember we did the Leila Seder, and there was only grape juice for obvious reasons. Alcohol is not allowed on base, but that was there was sufficient what to rely. Okay, it just mentioned here as well that one should be careful about diluting the grape juice there, as we said before. When dilutes it and it becomes majority water, so then it would no longer have the status of grape ragafen, and obviously that could not be used for Kiddush. Yes.
If you add about 10%, 50% of water to the
yeah, so there are those that still add. As I said, we have the sources in the book. I didn't go through it, but again, it's just so long as one has to know, how much and what the percentages are, and not to add too much. Okay, what about white wine? White wine as opposed to red wine. So yeah, we have the Gemara says again. The Gemara Bavatra has a long sugya discussing different types of wines. It says Va mina of Kana Chamoda of Mashal Shamal Chema Chavalyan, clear white wine. Mao. Sorry, source number 49, bottom of page 44. Amale alter yain ki yitadam. He says no, the wine needs to be red. There's an indication that red wine is considered to be superior. Again, the discussion now whether that's just for the mizbeach, whether that's just for the mizbeach or that's for Kiddush as well. The Rashbam on the next page, source number 51, says he says this is talking about for the mizbeach. There are those who say for Kiddush as well, but to me that seems to be incorrect. Okay, I haven't had that distinction, but the Shulchan Aruch over here, number 52, he says, Shulchan Aruch Mekachin al yain lavan. He says one can make Kiddush over white wine. The Ramban said no, you cannot. You can use it for Kiddush. He said you could use it for Haftarah. Nonetheless, Minhag Haolam Kisfara Rishona. That is the Minhag Haolam. It says the Mishnah Berurah Yain Lavan. He says that one should have red wine if possible. And however, if you don't have red wine or you have a superior wine, which is white wine, so then you could look at Kiddush, make a Kiddush over white wine. Bottom line, whichever wine one prefers, or whichever is superior quality, whichever one wants, that is okay regarding Kiddush. By the way, by Leila Seder, we have a discussion as well. There are those who say that on Leila Seder, red wine is preferable. There are those who say why red wine is reminiscent of the blood of the story in Mitzrayim. There are those who say Dafka nowadays we should not use red wine because they're going to think that they're going to see us and they're going to think that it's blood, right? Things haven't changed. They still have blood libels against us, but in any event, the bottom line is either red wine or white wine, both would be permissible. Certainly, if one prefers white wine over red wine, which is superior quality, there's no problem with that. Okay, so we need to skip a few pages now because, as said before, we are not going according to the division of shiurim that is in the book because there's just too many sources in each shiur to get through in one go. So we've completed last week's shiur. Now we're beginning this week's and carry on next week. So we're not going to, I'll just say now, we're not going to get today, maybe next week we'll get there, the topic of Kiddush Makom Su'udah. We mentioned that and somebody asked me about it during the week, subsequent to the shiur. We will get there, Be'ezrat Hashem, but not today. Okay. But we're now on page 61. 61. Okay. So we have over here a discussion regarding eating before Kiddush. As we've already mentioned, there is a prohibition to eat before Kiddush. This is going to be stronger in the night than it is during the day. The Gemara Masechet Pesachim discusses this. Let's see the Rambam, source number 2. He says, "Asur la'adam le'echol o le'shtot yain mishekidesh hayom ad sheyeh kadesh." It's a bit confusing here because the word mishekidesh, what is that? So the first time he uses it, the mishekidesh hayom means when nightfall enters, meaning when Shabbat begins. Not that we have sanctified Shabbat, but ad sheyeh kadesh refers to when we have made Kiddush. So says the Rambam, from the time that Shabbat starts, you cannot eat or drink until you've made Kiddush. This is why we mentioned, I think, last week, that Shulchan Aruch writes, one comes home from shul and once you make Kiddush miyad, you shouldn't delay, but make people, don't wait people to get hungry. He says, same thing when Shabbat ends. Then when Shabbat ends also, you can't eat or drink or do anything until you've made the Havdalah. However, drinking water is permitted. So from the Rambam, when he says drinking water is permitted, when is he talking about? It sounds like he's not distinguishing between Kiddush and Havdalah. Based on the Rambam, it seems to be, everybody agrees that you can, before Havdalah, you could drink water. But it sounds like he's saying at the onset of Shabbat, you could drink water as well before you've made Kiddush. However, other Rishonim disagree. The Shulchan Aruch, source number 3, Asur litom klum kodem shekadesh afilu mayim. You can't eat anything before Kiddush, not even water.
How does that work with the Sedat Shachit? You have Sedat Shachit, and then you got a Marav, and you can't eat until you
So when
make
it
a dough.
comes to that, first of all, regarding Havdalah, you can drink water before Havdalah. But there, if you at the end of Shabbat, you start Sudash Veshit, you start your meal before Shabbat goes out, so you're allowed to continue your meal even later on. And so once if it gets after nightfall, and then the person, once you've benched, so then you've completed your meal. So if the person decides to bench, they haven't yet made Havdalah, and now they want to have something more to eat, so that would be problematic. However, you can extend it later on. Source number 5, on page 62, the Shemrat Shabbat Kel Chadar of Neuver, we mentioned earlier, he says that drinking water to take care of medication, etc., that would not be a problem. The person needs to take their medication before the meal, right? So and he can swallow them, and even to drink a bit of water with it. Not other drinks, but water would be permitted. That is even before Kiddush. That halakha, as we know, it comes up in Hilchot brachot as well. The halakha is that when one drinks, if one is drinking water because they're thirsty, so then you would make, of course, say a shakol. But if you are drinking water purely to ease taking medication and to help swallow, there is no bracha that would be said. If it's a different drink which has a flavor, so then you would say a bracha even if it's drunk for that purpose. So it will come to water. Okay, interesting. Again, Abraham over here. Source number 6 is, what if a person doesn't have Kiddush, doesn't have wine, doesn't have bread, right? So you're not required to go hungry the whole night. You can't make Kiddush. However, if you have guests coming or something, you're expecting somebody to bring you. Let's say you forgot to get wine for Shabbat, and your guests are going to bring it. And somebody asked me last week, what if we have guests on a Friday night and they went off to the Karabach Minyan, and they're 3 hours later they're still davening and we're waiting for them. So they asked the question, it was very in the sense of the Choterach Eretz, how long is one required to wait if the guests don't come? That we'll say for another time. But yeah. So it says like Ray and Sukkah. So it says again, Abraham, source number 6. When it comes to Kiddush of night, im ein lo pat, ochel belo Kiddush, וכתבו מקום שאין יין ובבית כנסת אי אפשר לקדש בפת לאורחים, וכתבו אומר ברכה מהם 7 ויוצאים בזה. If you don't have bread, you don't have wine, you say Kiddush, you eat without it. Or it's not possible to say Kiddush, so you eat. However, page 63, the second paragraph.
It's interesting, Rabbi Kenigsberg talked about a soldier in the field. It's from his point of view, he can do whatever he needs to do. It's just a matter of survival. And here we're saying you can do it even less than that. You're not in a battlefield. You can still do the same thing if you don't have it. If you don't have it, you don't have it. And yet, in the case of a battle, there's actually a pasuk, there's actually a Gemara that says, to do what you need to do.
Well,
But here, you've already established.
yeah, well, I mean, about Eruv, and he put that effect as an example from Nitilat Yadayim, and
yeah, those are
dealing with Rabbanan, and that would Rabbanan law goes over. But yeah, I say this is a very extenuating circumstance. One has no, one can't make Kiddush, so when we don't require a person to start. However, he says here on page 63, Mikom Makom, Nirali de'im mitzapeh she'aviu lo yamtin al kol panim ad chatzot halayla. David, that's for you. It's like sukkah, right? He says if you're expecting somebody, you don't have Kiddush, but somebody's going to bring it, so you can wait until chatzot, wait until midnight, and then yeah, that's right. אבל בקידוש היום אין צריך דאי שאומרים שמותר לאכול קודם וכדאי לסמוך עליהם בשעת הדחק. He says that when we're talking about the morning, you'll remember we discussed it. We saw machloket between the Rambam and the Ravid. What is Kiddush Hayom? Does it have the same restrictions and halachot related to Kiddush Halayla? And even though, like at Chila, we hold like the Rambam, the Ravid did say, and other Rishonim, that one is not required to wait to eat before that one would be permitted to eat before Kiddush in the day, and therefore in the day, certainly extenuating circumstances, you have what to rely on over there. Bottom line, nowadays, most of the time, we have food, we have wine, we have bread, we have. I think even if a person forgot to go, went shopping very late, you can normally get something. So this usually doesn't come up, but that's what to do in a very, very extenuating circumstance. I mean, we had cases here before when somebody came to me, I'm sure Shabbat morning, they're tourists visiting in the area. They I don't know, they didn't have any wine, or they didn't have anything for Kiddush, and they weren't able to get, so could we help them out in such a situation? So you're here, you're in the community, there's probably somebody who can lend you a little bit of wine or grape juice or whatever it is. Okay. Yeah. In terms of okay, so right. So that relates to another issue of eating and drinking before davening, which is its own question. Generally speaking, we'd say again, if a person needs to, if a person's like, especially on Shabbat where davening is much longer, and a person's not going to be able to concentrate and without their morning coffee or whatever it is. So there are leniencies, and is what to rely on. If one's practice, there are those who are stringent on that as well and won't have anything except for water before coming to davening. But if one's practice is to have coffee before davening in the morning, so then related to the question of Kiddush. So the answer is, I think we discussed it previously, I don't remember, but the obligation of Kiddush in the day only kicks in once one is davening. So therefore, again, if it's coffee or a small thing, so then if it's before davening, then one would not be required to make Kiddush at that point. One is not yet obligated until they started davening. As I say, it's a separate issue which we have to resolve of how one can eat before davening. You could, but the question is whether you're required to. Okay, if you're going to start having cake and a 3-course breakfast and whatever, so then it becomes a bit more of an issue. But certainly for coffee before davening, if one that's one practice, then one would not be required to. Sometimes it can be very difficult, especially in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so we start davening at 8:30, we're done by 10:30, whatever it is. Sometimes davening doesn't start until 9:30, 10 o'clock. By the time you finish, so that can be very, very difficult. This is why, as well, in many places there is a practice to have a kiddush on Rosh Hashanah before Musaf. Especially even in yeshivot nowadays, where davening is going to go on very, very late. The davening goes on until 2 o'clock, 2:30. Now you start at 7 and you go till 2:30. You're going to be hungry. You're not going to be able to daven properly, even though ideally one is not meant to eat there before Tkiyat Shofar. It's another issue. However, there are many poskim who are lenient in that. Others say it's preferable. No, shorten the davening a little bit. So you don't have to eat before Tkiyat Shofar. And then, so each place, narrow pashta, as they say, each place goes according to its minhag. What about, okay, I think we have time for maybe one more topic today, which is sitting or standing during Kiddush. Should one sit or should one stand? So the Shulchan Aruch in Siman, Reish Gimel, source number 7, page 64, a little bit of background. So first of all, when it comes to our practice nowadays, is that normally, it's more common during the week, everybody makes their own bracha. But on Shabbat, the contract, one person makes Kiddush for everybody, or one person makes a matzah for everybody. That is what is done in many places. And the question is, what needs to be done in order for everybody to join together? If one person is saying a bracha, how it has to be clear that everybody else is included, that the eating is taking place together. In the days of the Gemara, how would you know that people were eating together? They would recline. We still have remnants of this on Leila Seder, on Pesach night. In those days, I'm not sure exactly how it was. They didn't sit on chairs around tables like we did. Everybody had their own small table where they would sit and eat. That's why when the Mishnayot and the Gemara Pesachim tells us about the order of Leila Seder, it says, nowadays, what do? We cover up the plate, or we uncover it, we open or close it. They bring the table, and they take the table away. Nowadays, we told everybody, Leila Seder, you have to, every stage, take your table away and bring it back in. I think we would have a few medical problems as well. But in those days, that's how it was done. And everybody would recline. So when people are reclining together, you know that they are eating together. Again, this comes up, we have discussed in the past, but it's going to come up again very soon, with less than 2 months away from Pesach. So the whole mitzvah of Haseva, of reclining on Leila Seder, because that is the comfortable way of eating. That is derech herut. That is the way that free people eat, and therefore everybody knows that the first time when you start learning these halachot, the first time you start reclining, and you get a little bit clumsy, and it's not. For most of us, it's more comfortable to just sit normally. So that is why the Ravia is one of the Rishonim. It's amazing. Certain Rishonim and certain poskim. There's one halacha which they taught, by which they become known. The Ravia as a Rishonim appears many places in halakha. But everybody knows the Ravia, everybody remembers the Ravia by Pesach. Because what does the Ravia say about Pesach? He says, nowadays, we don't recline. That's not how normal people eat anymore. And therefore, there is no more mitzvah of HaSeva. That's the Ravia. Now, we don't rely on it lekatchila. We still say that you are required to, for the 4 cups, for matzah, etc. But there are circumstances where we take it into account. So, for example, a woman required to recline or not. So we say, we bring into account the opinion of the Ravia. And therefore we say, if they want to, they're allowed to, but if they don't want to, they're exempt based on that opinion of the Ravia. Also, b'diavad, in certain instances, that closer to Pesach, we'll maybe discuss more, but in certain instances when one was meant to recline and one did not, would you have to go back and do it again? So sometimes we say yes, sometimes we say no. We can rely on the Ravia. That is in terms of reclining. By the way, if nowadays we don't recline, nobody eats like that, right? What's the svara to say? The Ravia makes a lot of sense, but all the other Rishonim, nobody else practices like it. Shulchan Aruch and everybody says nowadays we still do recline. So what's the logic? What's the svara behind it? The logic is that on Leila Seder, right, before the on Leila Seder, what we do now is irrelevant. It's what did we do? We're going back in time. We're doing what we did when we came out of Egypt. And at that time, was that the normal way? Was that the way of expressing derech herut? Yes, and that's why we should do it now. We spoke in the week about Zechel HaMikdash and all these. There's a very, very strong motif of all of Leila Seder about remembering Zechel HaMikdash, going back at least to the times of the Beit HaMikdash, going back to the times of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And at those times, that was the normal way of doing it, and that's why we still do it. Okay, but so that is when it comes to so everybody reclines together. Nowadays, okay, Kiddush every week. Although we say Zechel Yetziat Mitzrayim, we are not required to recline every Shabbat when we say Kiddush, but we all sit at a table together. So generally speaking, how do you people are standing around in a room? That's not a way they all come together. You come together, you sit around the table, and therefore, It would seem to make more sense that for Kiddush, when one person is saying the bracha on behalf of everybody, everybody should be sitting together. Says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 7. Ledidan, have yeshiva kmo aseva ledidu. Nowadays, our sitting is the equivalent of their reclining, and therefore, lefize ledidan, the leikdan aseva, en chluk ben pat v'yayin yishav barim, the b'yeshiva, now in bold, b'yeshiva, afilu pat yayin echad mevarech lekulam. It says, if you are sitting, you're sitting around the table, then one can say the bracha for everybody, whether it's bread, whether it's wine. V'shelo b'yeshiva, but if you are not sitting, then b'shal dvarim, with other things, nami kol echad mevarech latzmo, we would think that everybody has to say the bracha for themselves. Okay, Tosfot raises this question when it comes to Havdalah, where people stand, and he says it seems to be strange. Would seem to make more sense that people should be sitting together. But there is another factor. There's another factor you have to take into consideration. The Korbo, source number 9, another one of the Rishonim. He says like this. He says, "Nachon lavdil milmad." So he starts off talking about Havdalah. We'll see how this applies to Kiddush as well. But he says it's correct to stand for Havdalah. We are escorting the honor of the king of Hashem, and therefore we need to be standing. That is appropriate. That is respectful. The Kiddush nami, in Kiddush also we are going out to greet the king. We say by Chulu on a Friday night we are giving. It's also brought in the Poskim that we are giving testimony. We're giving testimony to the creation of heaven and earth. And when a person gives testimony, one has to stand. When we are to make the honor of the king, one should stand. And therefore, he says, so based on that, it would have made sense for us to make Kiddush standing. So his conclusion is, since Kiddush is b'makom seudah, we will get to it, I promise. We'll get to the definition of makom seudah. But what's a seudah? You sit together and eat. You don't stand to eat a meal, right? So therefore, we sit. He says if one was to stand up for the opening, for the introduction of the meal, which is Kiddush, and then to sit down for the meal, he says that would look silly. Okay, that's what many people do, but the Kobo thought that it was silly.
For those people who say Kiddush standing up and then they sit down to actually drink.
So that is so therefore, based on this, so these are the two different what to say. On the one hand, since Kiddush, certainly the night, and we'll see a distinction between the night and the day as well. It's not just for Friday night for the moment. Since on the one hand it is the honor of the king, and you're giving testimony, that would mean you have to stand. On the other hand, you want to be part of the meal, therefore you should sit. So there are those who stand, and there are those who sit, and there are those who have the minhag, which is the beginning part you stand, which is by a full, and then once you get to a paragraph and you would sit down, you've stood up, you've given your testimony, now you can sit as it is, and that is so those are the different minhagim. So says the Beit Yosef, source number 10. Says Lini Red Makadesh Mu'mad Nami, Kevan de Samuch Leshuchanu Shapir Mikre B'Makom Suda. Okay, so he says, first of all, the fact that you're standing around the table, so for those who stand, that is sufficient for the fact that it's B'Makom Suda. In the Shulchan Aruch, here it's number 11, Ve'omer V'Echulu Mu'mad, one should say V'Echulu, standing. V'Achar Omer V'Le Plagafen V'Achar Kiddush. He doesn't say anything about whether you sit down. Says the Ramah over the page 66, says Yachol La'amod B'Shat Kiddush, Yoter Tov Leshev. Says Ramah, you could stand at the time of Kiddush, now after Vayachulu, but it's better to sit. And then he says, Noagin Hashem, Af B'Shat Shomer Vayachulu. Rak Shematchilim Umdim K'tzat Yechvod Hashem. So there was even a practice to sit for Vayachulu, just to stand for a little bit at the beginning, to give the honor. Ki matchilim Yom Hashishi Vayachulu Hashamayim. Right, look at those letters. It's involved in Yom Hashishi Vayachulu Hashamayim. That is Yud, a Hey, and then a Vav, and then a Hey. That is the name of Hashem. So one stands a little bit for that, and then sits down. So summarizes here the Mishnah Berurah. He says, Yoter Tov Leshev, B'Bechiyai Gavna Mikra Tzvei Kiddush Makom Suda. If you are sitting, that is to a greater extent full Kiddush at the place of the meal. כיוון שיושב במקום סעודתו בית הקידוש, וכן הסכים ביום הרגלה, the Vilna Gaon agrees. Mitam Acher, he says for a different reason. That's what we explained earlier. That if one person is saying the bracha on behalf of others, so the fact it's all sitting together, that makes it easier in terms of Hilchot brachot. And based on that, it says, so therefore it's better for everyone to sit, and to certainly everybody needs to be concentrating and needs to be at the same place. It goes on, it says if one, you're walking around the table at the time when somebody's, sometimes you have the kids, running off the other room and somebody's running after them. So no, you should, at least for the time of Kiddush, that should be avoided. There are those as well who stand for Kiddush at night and sit for Kiddush during the day. Okay, I'm not talking about the Kiddush that we have in Shul where everybody's standing because there's no place to sit, but that's something else. But that's for convenience. But really, in the daytime Kiddush, there is much greater room to sit down. You're not saying by Chulu, you're not giving testimony, it's just Makom Subeh. So just to summarize, source number 14, that's Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. He says, many have the custom to stand on Friday night. That is our testimony about the creation of the world. We discussed this when we spoke about Vayachulu a little bit in Tefillah as well. The witnesses need to stand. Okay, so that is the minhag that many have to stand. Then he says, there is an Ashkenazi minhag as we've seen to sit for Kiddush. As we explained, the Kiddush needs to be at the place of the Seudah, which is done sitting down. And additionally, the second reason, the first reason we discussed, that causes us all to be a clearly defined group relating to the brachot. Right? And then we have the custom
beginning and then to sit during the Kiddush. Then he says, according to everybody, when it's daytime Kiddush, better to sit. That is the prevalent minhag. Nonetheless, if one stands, one is still fulfilled the obligation, if not prohibited. Okay, Adkan. The next topic we have, very exciting, covering the challah. We'll talk about that next week, and maybe we'll even get to Kiddush Makom Suda. Okay, great day, everybody. Great week. Great month.